before clocks divided the day, before calendars gave meaning to years, before memory learned how to cling to moments and call them history. In that time, the world moved slowly enough for silence to exist, not the empty silence of absence, but the deep silence of balance, where nothing needed to speak because everything already belonged. Close your eyes and let the modern world fade. Let roads dissolve, cities soften, and the idea of permanence slip quietly from your thoughts. Forget the forest, Forget the river that winds like a living artery through South America today. Forget even the name Amazon, because names come late to the story of the earth. Long before the first tree reached for the sky in that region, long before birds filled the air with sound, the heart of the continent was water, not a river, not a swamp, but a vast inland sea, stretching farther than the eye could ever follow, breathing beneath an ancient sun. The light rose gently over its surface each day, spilling across endless fresh water, turning the world into reflection. Sky above, sky below, no edges, no borders, only water meeting light, again and again, for millions of years. This was a world shaped not by urgency, but by patience. Rain fell from warm Miocene clouds, soft and uncounted, feeding a basin that had nowhere to release its gift. Rivers arrived from distant lands, carrying stories of mountains still learning how to stand tall, and when they reached the lowlands, they did not continue onward. They slowed, they spread, they surrendered. Water gathered the way memory gathers quietly, persistently, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The lake grew not in sudden conquest, but in gentle expansion. Land disappeared beneath it without resistance. Valleys filled, plains softened. What had once been ground became depth, and what had been distance became stillness. The earth did not fight this change. It allowed it. Above the surface, the air was thick with warmth and moisture, heavy in a way that felt eternal. The planet was younger then, warmer, unburdened by ice at its poles. Seasons existed, but they did not command. They whispered. Time did not press forward, it drifted, and life responded the same way. Creatures emerged slowly, thoughtfully, shaped by water that did not punish haste. Massive turtles moved like living continents, their shells worn smooth by ages that had no need to hurry. Crocodilians ruled the shallows, longer and heavier than any seen today, their eyes carrying no malice, only ancient authority. Fish evolved into forms so strange they felt more imagined than real, their bodies adapting to a world where boundaries were blurred and depth was the only certainty. Above them, insects traced lazy patterns through the air. Early birds skimmed the surface, touching water and sky in the same breath. Everything existed in balance, not because balance was enforced, but because nothing demanded more than it needed. There were no witnesses to admire this world. No humans stood on its shores, because there were no shores to stand upon. No voices named the creatures that lived here. No stories were told beside fires that had not yet been invented. And yet, this place mattered deeply, because it was laying the foundation for everything that would come after. The forest you know today, the one that feels ancient and untouchable, stands upon the memory of this water. Its roots press into soil once shaped by waves. Its rivers follow paths first imagined by the slow movement of a lake that believed it would last forever. Beneath the surface, unseen and uncelebrated, the earth was writing its record. Fine particles of mud drifted downward, settling softly, layer by layer, like snowfall that never melted. Each layer carried a whisper of the moment it was formed, a change in water chemistry, a shift in life, a quiet disappearance. Time was being stored not in stories, but in sediment. This was how the planet remembered. Far to the west, something was beginning to stir. The Andes Mountains were rising. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a determination that only geological time can understand. Each year, the land lifted by an amount too small for any living creature to notice, yet immense in its consequence. As the mountains grew, they changed the fate of water itself. Paths that once led toward the Pacific began to close. Drainage slowed, pressure built. The lake deepened in places, stagnated in others. Oxygen levels shifted. Life adjusted where it could, and where it could not, it simply faded from existence. There were no final moments, no grand endings. Extinction arrived quietly. Species that had lived for ages stopped appearing in the layers below. Their absence became the only marker of their passing. The lake did not mourn them. The earth did not pause. It continued, because continuation is what it does best. Still, the surface remained calm. Still, the sun rose each day over water that seemed endless. Still, the illusion of permanence held. This is the most dangerous comfort nature ever offers, the belief that what exists now has always existed, and therefore always will. The lake believed it, 2. It spread across the continent like a held breath, unaware that the earth beneath it was slowly preparing to exhale. Water is patient, but it is not passive. It does not confront obstacles. It waits for them to change, and when it is trapped, when it has nowhere left to go, it gathers strength without noise, without warning. Deep beneath the lake, pressure accumulated. The weight of water pressed into the land. The rising mountains tightened their grip. The planet, though calm on the surface, was shifting toward transformation. No one could have known. There were no signs written in the sky. No tremors felt along invisible shores. No voice spoke to announce what was coming, because the earth does not announce change. It simply begins it. Long after this world would disappear, humans would walk through dense forest, unaware that they were standing on the remains of an inland sea. Scientists would one day kneel in the soil, brushing dirt from fossilized shells, freshwater creatures buried far from any lake, far from any river that could explain them, and in that quiet moment of discovery, they would feel it. The presence of something vast that once existed here, a ghost made of water. But in this moment, this chapter, the lake is still alive, still breathing beneath the sun, still believing in its own eternity. The forest has not yet arrived. The great river has not yet chosen its path. The earth is calm, and beneath that calm, it is already moving. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. It does not crash through the door or announce itself with thunder. It does not warn or explain or ask to be understood. Change arrives quietly, patiently, often so slowly that those living within it believe nothing is happening at all. The ancient lake felt this before it understood it. Far to the west, the land continued to rise. What had once been a gentle swell of stone grew taller, heavier, more determined. The Andes Mountains were learning how to stand, and in doing so, they were rewriting the destiny of everything beneath the sky. Each year, the earth lifted by the smallest fraction imaginable, a movement too subtle to disturb the water's surface, too slow to alarm the creatures that lived within it. But the planet felt it. The weight shifted, the balance tilted, and the water began to notice. Currents that once moved freely slowed, then stalled. River mouths widened into stillness. Sediment thickened, turning clear depths into murkier worlds. In some places the lake grew deeper, pressing down with quiet authority. In others, it became shallow and stagnant, warm and heavy, holding heat like a held breath. Life responded the only way it knew how. Some creatures adapted, their bodies changing with remarkable patience. Fish developed new ways to breathe, shells thickened, behaviors shifted. Survival became an act of subtle adjustment rather than dramatic escape. Others were not so fortunate. They vanished without ceremony, leaving behind no sound, no struggle, no memory beyond a sudden absence in the layers below. The earth did not record their names, it only recorded that they were once here and then they were not. Extinction, in this world, did not feel like an ending, it felt like forgetting. Above the water, the air grew heavier, moisture lingered longer. The sky reflected a world that no longer moved as freely as it once had. The lake, vast and ancient, was beginning to feel enclosed. Water does not understand fear, but it understands pressure. As the mountains rose higher, they sealed pathways that water had relied on for millions of years. Routes to the west closed one by one, redirecting rivers back into the basin. The lake expanded further, swallowing more land, not in growth but in confinement. What had once felt infinite now felt contained, and containment changes everything. The lake's chemistry shifted. Freshwater remained, but it was no longer refreshed the way it once had been. Nutrients accumulated, oxygen fluctuated, life became denser, more crowded, more competitive. Still, the surface remained calm. The sun continued to rise and set over water that appeared unchanged. From above, nothing seemed wrong. The illusion of stability held strong, even as the foundations quietly rearranged themselves. This is how the earth transforms itself, not by destroying what exists, but by slowly making it impossible for the old world to continue. Beneath the lake bed, the pressure grew. Sediments compressed under their own weight, layer pressing against layer, storing the story of every subtle shift. Each change left its mark, a fingerprint that would one day be read by minds not yet born. But for now, there was no reader, only time. The lake endured, but endurance is not the same as permanence. The water, once free to spread endlessly, now felt the invisible walls closing in. It searched for relief the only way it knew how, by testing every weakness, every low point, every fracture in the land. Water is relentless, but never impatient. It waited. In places where the land dipped slightly lower, currents grew stronger. Where stone cracked beneath ancient pressure, water pressed closer. It did not force its way through. It leaned, persisted, remembered. The mountains above did not notice. They continued to rise, proud and unyielding, unaware that every inch of height they gained increased the urgency below. This was not a battle. It was a negotiation measured in millions of years. The creatures of the lake felt the difference long before the lake itself understood what was coming. Migration patterns shifted, breeding grounds disappeared. Some species moved toward deeper waters, others toward shallower margins that barely existed. The edges of the lake became places of tension. Here, water met land more often. Plants experimented with rooting in saturated soil. Early forms of vegetation began to test life at the boundary between submerged and exposed. They did not yet resemble forests, but they were learning. Learning always begins in discomfort. The lake, once a place of perfect balance, was becoming a place of transition. And transition is always fragile. Some days the water level rose higher than it ever had before. Other days it receded slightly, exposing mud that had not seen light in ages. These changes were subtle, easy to dismiss, but they carried meaning. The earth was exhaling. Deep beneath the basin, stress built along unseen fault lines. The continent was adjusting to the weight it carried, responding to the slow but unstoppable rise of the Andes. Pressure sought release, not in explosions, but in pathways. And one day, though day is far too small, a word water found the beginning of an escape. At first, it was nothing more than a suggestion, a direction, a slight preference in flow toward the east, a place where resistance was marginally weaker than everywhere else. But water remembers. Once it sensed the possibility of movement, it returned to it again and again, deepening the path by degrees too small to notice. What began as a whisper of motion became a murmur. What was a murmur slowly became intention. The lake did not drain suddenly. It hesitated, as if unsure whether it was ready to let go of the world it had been. Millions of years of stillness do not release ice, and so the lake lingered, caught between what it was and what it was becoming, neither fully trapped nor fully free, a world suspended in uncertainty. If the earth could feel emotion, this would have been its moment of hesitation, because every great transformation requires loss. As water began to move slowly, carefully, ecosystems fractured. Some regions dried just enough to change forever. Others deepened, concentrating life into smaller spaces. Competition increased, adaptation accelerated. The lake was no longer a singular world, it was becoming many. Channels formed where none had existed before. Currents strengthened. The idea of direction, once meaningless, began to matter. Water learned the concept of forward, and with that knowledge, the end of the ancient lake became inevitable. Yet even now, nothing dramatic marked the moment. No waves rose in protest. No creatures fled in panic. Life continued, because life always continues until it cannot. The surface still mirrored the sky. The sun still painted gold across the water. To any observer who did not understand deep time, the lake would have appeared unchanged. But deep beneath, the earth had made its decision. The mountains would keep rising, the water would find its way, and the world that had existed for millions of years would slowly, quietly dissolve into something new. The lake did not know it yet, but it had already begun to let go, and in that letting go, the future was being born. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. At first, the water moved so gently that even the earth seemed unsure whether it was truly happening. There was no sound to mark the moment, no line in the sky to divide what had been from what was becoming. The ancient lake, which had held its breath for millions of years, began to release it slowly, carefully, as if afraid that too much movement might undo everything it had ever been. The east offered a promise, the west no longer could. Stone there was softer, less resolved, shaped by pressures that favored surrender over resistance. The continent leaned just enough for water to notice, and water, once aware of direction, never forgets it. What had once been stillness learned how to flow. At first, it was a suggestion rather than a command, a subtle drift in the deepest layers. A current that returned more often to the same low places. Sediment followed, carving pathways so faint they existed only as intention. But intention is powerful when given time. The lake began to thin, not everywhere, not all at once, but in patterns. Margins emerged where water had long ruled alone. Mud met air. The surface that had reflected only sky now reflected change. Life hesitated. Creatures that had known only depth and openness found themselves navigating boundaries for the first time. Shallows expanded. Deep basins shrank. Some species followed the retreating water, clinging to familiarity. Others lingered in places that no longer belonged to them, caught between adaptation and disappearance. The lake was no longer one body. It was becoming a system, Channels strengthened where water returned again and again. Flow gained memory. What had once spread evenly across the land now gathered purpose, choosing routes that promised escape. The earth, responding to its own pressure, offered paths where it could, and the water accepted. As movement increased, the world transformed quietly but completely. Regions that had been submerged for ages began to dry, their surfaces cracking under a sun they had not felt before. Minerals crystallized, organic matter settled and hardened. The earth prepared new ground without knowing who or what would one day stand upon it. Where water remained, it deepened and narrowed, life compressed, competition sharpened. Evolution quickened its pace, not through chaos, but through necessity. This was not destruction, it was refinement. The lake, vast and ancient, was not vanishing. It was reorganizing. And in that reorganization, something entirely new began to take shape. Flow became rhythm, rhythm became direction, direction became identity. A river was being born, not in a single place, not in a single moment, but across an entire continent, woven together from countless small decisions made by water over unimaginable spans of time. The future Amazon did not arrive as a conqueror, it arrived as a solution. Water followed the path of least resistance toward the east, carving gently at first. Then with growing confidence, each movement made the next easier. Each channel deepened the memory of flow. The lake loosened its grip. What had once been a singular, breath-holding presence became a network of arteries and veins, feeding into a growing current that no longer spread, it traveled. And travel changes everything. Sediment that had once settled now moved. Nutrients redistributed. Life learned to migrate with purpose rather than drift with patience. The world learned speed. Still, this speed was slow by human measure. Generations of creatures lived and died without noticing the larger story they were part of. Forests had not yet arrived, but the idea of them was forming. Plants experimented with rooting deeper, reaching higher, claiming ground that no longer drowned beneath constant water. The air changed. Timidity shifted. Winds learned new patterns. Clouds followed different paths. The sky itself responded to the rearrangement below. Everything was connected. As the lake continued to drain, remnants remained vast wetlands, shallow seas of memory where water lingered, unwilling or unable to let go completely. These places became sanctuaries for ancient life, echoes of what once dominated the continent, but they were shrinking. Slowly, relentlessly, the inland sea surrendered its reign. The great lake that had once believed in its own eternity now existed only in fragments, stitched together by channels that led away from it. What remained was no longer the center of the world. The center was moving. The river grew stronger, its path more defined, its pull undeniable. It carried with it the story of everything. It replaced minerals' life, history dragging the memory of the lake toward a distant ocean that waited patiently. The Atlantic had always been there, it had simply been out of reach. Now, at last, the water was coming home. As the connection strengthened, the balance tipped beyond recovery. Drainage accelerated, not suddenly, but decisively. What remained of the ancient lake receded into wetlands and floodplains, shadows of its former self, and in the spaces it left behind, the forest began its quiet arrival. Seeds took hold in soil enriched by millions of years of sediment. Roots pressed into ground that had learned how to hold water, how to give without drowning. Life above ground flourished in ways the lake could never have imagined. Green replaced blue, silence filled with sound. The Amazon rainforest was not a replacement. It was an inheritance, yet beneath every tree, beneath every inch of soil, the memory of water remained. Fossils lay waiting. Layers of mud whispered of depth and stillness and time before flow. The forest did not erase the lake, it grew from it. If loss feels heavy here, it is because creation always carries the weight of what it replaces. Something had to end for something else to begin. The earth does not mourn these endings, but if humans could witness them, they might. Because the lake did not fail, it fulfilled its purpose. It shaped the continent, prepared the soil, guided the river, and then stepped aside without resistance. It became history so the future could exist. By the time the Amazon River fully claimed its path to the sea, the ancient lake was already a memory written in stone and sediment. The inland ocean that had once defined the land was gone, not destroyed, but transformed beyond recognition. And the earth moved on, as it always does. Yet even now, even today, when the river floods and wetlands expand, when the forest breathes moisture into the sky and the air grows heavy with rain, the old lake remembers itself. It rises and echoes, in seasonal waters, in hidden fossils, in the shape of the land. The Amazon flows because the lake once waited, and nothing that waits that long ever truly disappears. Not gone in the way something disappears suddenly, but gone in the way childhood fades, leaving behind impressions rather than presence. What once held the sky in its reflection now held trees. What once breathed as water now breathed as forest. The Amazon rainforest stood where an inland sea had waited for millions of years, and no one knew. Early humans walked beneath towering canopies, unaware that their footsteps pressed into ground shaped by waves older than memory. Rivers flowed beside them, powerful and restless, carrying stories they could not yet tell. The world felt ancient to them, unchanging, eternal. But the earth had already proven otherwise. Beneath the roots of colossal trees, beneath layers of living green, the lake still existed not as water, but as memory. Sediments lay stacked like pages in a book no one had learned to read yet. Fossils rested in darkness, patient, untouched, holding the shape of lives that belonged to a different world. The forest grew thick and loud, alive in ways the lake had never been. Birds filled the air with sound. Insects stitched the silence into constant motion. Rain fell often, feeding a system so vast it created its own weather, its own breath. From above the Amazon looked endless, from within it felt eternal, and that illusion held for a while. Much later, long after human stories had multiplied and spread, some began to notice something that did not quite belong. Shells far from any shore, sediments that spoke of still water rather than flowing rivers, fossils of freshwater creatures buried deep beneath forest soil. Quiet questions formed. How did this get here? What world existed before this one? Scientists knelt in the mud, brushing away time grain by grain, and listened, not with ears, but with understanding. The earth began to speak, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. They realized the impossible truth. The Amazon had once been a lake so vast it reshaped a continent, a lake so patient it waited millions of years to let go, a lake whose end was not an ending, but a transformation. In that realization, something shifted, not just in knowledge, but in humility. Because if something as immense as an inland sea could vanish, replaced by forest and river, then nothing on this planet was truly permanent. Not mountains, not oceans, not even the systems we depend on to survive. The earth had changed before, and it would change again. The Amazon River now flows eastward, carrying the legacy of that ancient water toward the Atlantic. Each flood season, it remembers what it once was. Each expansion into wetlands echoes the lake's old breath. Each deposit of sediment is a quiet reminder that history is never gone, it is only buried. The forest above listens, whether it knows it or not. Trees drink from soil shaped by water older than them. Roots follow paths once carved by currents. Life thrives because the lake prepared the way. Nothing here is accidental. Everything is inherited. And yet, for the first time in Earth's long story, there is something new walking beneath the canopy. Something that watches, something that remembers, something that can choose. Humans now stand where oceans once waited and forests now rise. We build, extract, alter, believing the world beneath us is stable because it has always been this way in our lifetime. But lifetimes are brief. The earth measures in ages. The story of the Amazon mega lake is not a warning shouted in panic. It is a truth spoken calmly, patiently, without judgment. It says only this: what exists now exists because something else ended, and what exists now will one day change. This knowledge does not ask for fear, it asks for respect, because the forest you see is not guaranteed. The river you depend on is not promised. The balance you assume will hold has already failed long before you were here to notice. The earth does not need permission to transform. It never has. As night falls over the modern Amazon, the forest exhales moisture into the sky. Clouds gather. Rain returns. Water moves again, endlessly cycling, endlessly remembering. Somewhere deep beneath the roots, beneath the living green, beneath layers of time pressed softly together, the ancient lake still waits not to return, but to be remembered. It reminds the planet of patience. It reminds water of direction. It reminds us that permanence is an illusion. The Amazon was once a lake, and one day, far beyond the reach of human memory, it may become something else entirely. The earth will not explain itself when that happens. It will simply continue, and the story will begin again. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel.